I'm not sure about stats now, but I remember at least a year or so ago, they were claiming that hundreds and hundreds of millions are arrested. Really huge amounts.
That's European Union or that's globally?
No, that's an ABLV.
ABLV only. Oh, okay.
Only, yes. It's a very serious kind of thing. Okay, and here it becomes first tricky thing.
Looking into the future, so what should people do and how should people, let's say, unlikely event, hopefully that will not happen to prudent businessmen and then people with funds, but let's say, what would you do to avoid this kind of situation, this kind of case, if you have a longer history of your original funds, right? Because this is what we're eventually talking about, 10 years of history or whatever. We're not talking about somebody sold his company shares and, everything's quite obvious. But if there's a longer history of money management,
there's no straightforward answer. One proposition is they send a recommendation with all the documents. So you have provided answers. They send all that to this nice organization, which will
nice.
Yeah, nice. and then.
Welcome, Edgars. Welcome to the studio. I think this interview has been very long in the making for different kinds of reasons, but I'm glad to have you here. And I think this is going to be an exciting journey for Esketit investors and whoever is watching this show. So while I was preparing, I looked into a LinkedIn profile of yours because I know you for, 5-6 years?
Yeah, something
roughly. And I never looked into your LinkedIn profile, so I decided to look into that. And it was written there that you focus on cross-border tax issues, investment-related transactions, fiduciary and asset protection, and holding structures. So all of that is correct, I assume, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, good. So we discussed previously that, where this discussion should go, right? And you, in your practice, you have been close to bank liquidation cases. And in Latvia, we had a couple of them. I think one was recent with Baltic International Bank, and one was a couple of years ago, which was ABLV case, right? And you were sort of around those, let's call them infamous situations. Maybe you could share a little bit of your experience about the situations which arose during the bank liquidation and when it came to asset protection, or specifically money that was on the client's accounts during that process.
Okay. First of all, thanks for having me here, and in principle, you made a pretty fair introduction of me, and I'm an attorney specialized in more or less these issues which you raised. Speaking about banks in Latvia and I would say recent events which already last probably at least 5-7 years, is that some time ago it seemed it will be forever that Latvia will stay so-called like Switzerland of Baltics or Eastern Europe, or some would claim like a place of dirty Russian money, as some other would claim just having, it was considered to be kind of safe European harbor for people from the Eastern countries, if looking from our side, where they could keep their assets safely, and it felt very kind of stable and safe. But you used the word liquidation. Unfortunately, it's not only liquidation. It's most of the cases are, technically speaking, insolvency, right? So which means that, to some extent, basically, simply speaking, bank runs out of money and is not able to continue.
But it was not the case with the ABLV bank, right?
Correct.
It was a pretty healthy bank with good financials.
True. In my humble opinion, if we step aside from different kind of allegations of some misbehavior, ABLV was probably the best corporate bank in Latvia, and maybe, I don't know, in region or ever, yes, meaning like client service and so on. And to my understanding, up until the end, an end means that American authorities made a hint that they think that there's something wrong happening, and those are allegations. And I've heard that and read that ABLV probably are even doing some kind of litigation type of activities
currently.
Yeah, even currently. But frankly, I can't comment as I'm not involved. But in principle, everybody understands that if FinSec, I think it's called, but if American authorities are basically claiming that you are doing you're doing some wrongful doings, that's basically the end of your banking kind of career or business. Yes, and that's roughly what happened. And then there was this big question, what to do, and there's a lot of speculations, and even one colleague of ours was unfortunately shot, but now it seems that it's not related to that, but who knows?
Seems that.
But I mean, even the fact that somebody was shot and there were plenty of allegations and publications that it might be related indicated how hot topic it was, and there were some theories that there are certain influential groups in the countries whose dream was to cut in pieces, basically, like ABLV. But eventually, ABLV managed to start a so-called self-liquidation process, which is kind of different from all these other banks which collapsed. And self-liquidation basically more or less meant that a bank was financially healthy. Maybe it had like at least, again, allegations. It's I'm not sure whether it's really proven in any court, but some allegations that at least some of the assets in the bank were illicit, and but the big difference was with ABLV that the bank went. You can't really say it was voluntary, probably, as it was like to some extent forced, but at least it was a self-liquidation process, which meant basically that we will work on distributing assets and deposits back to the bank clients. That's kind of different from all these other banks. Like now, it's like Baltic International Bank will end up, but it just seems probably in some insolvency. But Trust Commerzbank, I believe, also went into insolvency ultimately, and Kraibanka, all these kind of guys.
In around this experience of bank liquidations and protecting clients' assets, I mean, you've been part and you've heard obviously inside stories about how things go wrong for bank clients with substantial amounts of funds on accounts at the moment of the liquidation or insolvency or whatever, and that it is not always, let's say, as straightforward as it is presented. That you will get your money back in case there's sufficient amount of funds available to the bank, things like that. Do you have any, let's say, top of the mind experiences, cases that would be, let's say, showcasing these situations?
I think that ABLV self-liquidation and all the processes which are around the bank, I think these to some extent are also historical kind of, at least from the perspective of our country, it's kind of historical moment in time, because in my subjective view, the processes which go around ABLV, it challenged actually rule of law in general in in our country, and what can be done and what cannot be done, and what is meant to have a property, under what rules you can be subject to confiscation of your property. What is burden of proof? To what extent authorities have to follow the principles of presumption of innocence. I guess that's correct, how I say. And burden of proof of showing that there was some crime. Because when basically, this is a fundamental thing in Western democracy, property rights. It's basically one of the bases for democratic society, and simply speaking, when you have property and to lose it just because authorities make a decision that you have to lose it, you must commit some serious kind of wrongdoing, basically committing a crime, right? And
which means that you have to be proven that you've committed a crime, I guess.
Basically, yes, yeah. And though, of course, I can't really say that I'm such an expert in this theory. Confiscation of property is some kind of rather discussed topic, because how can you basically can be punished? Yes, classical thing would be that somebody takes your freedom, right, as a punishment. In early days, somebody could take your life, yes, and in some countries it still can happen, right, but not in kind of so developed kind of part of Western civilization as European Union, and taking your property is another type of punishment, basically, and then there is kind of this issue, yes, to what extent your property should be confiscated. Without going into details, for some crimes it's kind of additional, basically, punishment. They also take your property. But it is to somewhat questionable. Of course, if you stole property or used proceeds from some kind of stolen property, it kind of makes sense to confiscate it. But of course, when it's unrelated, then it can be questionable. But starting with ABLV story, I think what was surprising, and it's still surprising. When did it start? Actually, it was 2018, probably. I think so.
Yeah, 18.
Yeah. So, I usually do this analogy, which kind of surprised me. Maybe it's justifiable, but frankly, I can barely see this justification. And I put this analogy that we are sitting in the Riga center in a restaurant, and suddenly some helicopter is flying over us, and somebody in a loud mechanical voice is telling us that for time being we all will continue to sit in the Riga center, and we will not go home because certain perimeter is now closed, and because some authorities have claimed allegedly that amongst us there are many criminals. We are now subject basically to checking, that we cannot leave, that now like authorities will check effectively each of us, whether we are a criminal or we are not a criminal, and we will have to provide certain documents and answer the questions, whether we are somehow related to some crimes.
Yep.
So to some extent, and by analogy I mean basically deposits of the clients were subjected to similar kind of process. It was basically terms and conditions of this liquidation was that, you know what, you cannot go. Basically, now we will check each of you. And for your own money, basically, we will hire well-known
The bank client pays for all the investigations or things like that.
No, probably not in that way. And if I say something wrong, I have to make reservations that I have not installed this process, but somebody has to pay for it, right?
Yeah, eventually.
And it seems that the bank pays for it.
Of course. So eventually the clients pay.
Yeah, eventually probably the clients pay or shareholders pay, or at least those should be assets in the bank. And that's how the story starts. Because when you also filed, let's say, these creditor claims, basically you were supposed to sign in that application that you agreed to these terms and conditions, as there was no other option. Basically. Yeah.
So just to let's say put it all in perspective, I'm a client of a bank. I have 1 million on account. Some kind of insolvency or liquidation process, or some government institution was not happy with the bank's business, and then their license is revoked. And this is where our story begins, basically, right? So what happens then in this specific case and from this specific perspective?
Yeah, and in this specific case happens the following. As I said, you formally file a creditor claim, and then you sign also on that same claim that you agree with these terms and conditions. So basically, you're forced. You don't have a real choice. You have to agree to that.
Yeah, if you want your money back.
Yeah, if you want your money back, basically, yes. And then for some time there was nothing was happening because some expensive, most likely very expensive consultants would analyze each and every client, like whether he's good or not good, or whether he basically would start like vetting whether there is any indication of a crime. And then at certain stage, I'm not sure whether everybody, but probably most of the clients would receive a long questionnaire, like, why did you send money there? From whom did you get it? Like, lots of questions, like. And this is a very tricky part. I'm not sure about stats now, but I remember at least a year or so ago, they were claiming that hundreds and hundreds of millions are arrested. And like really huge amounts.
That's European Union or that's globally?
No, that's an ABLV. ABLV only.
Oh, okay.
Only, yes. It's a very serious kind of thing. Okay, and here becomes first tricky thing. What usually you don't hear, that when you answer these questions, you provide documents. Actually, these documents later on will be used in criminal case against you. So basically, there's this nice liquidation procedure where you collect papers yourself, and normally, if you would have a normal kind of criminal procedure, you would know that
you are in the process.
You're in the process, basically. But in this case, they nicely and politely collect your documents, and then they go through it, and there's a kind of questionnaire, basically with the final kind of box, whether you should receive your deposit back, or recommendation from these people who are like going through it. They send it to FIU, what's like Financial Investigation Unit.
Yeah,
they send a recommendation with all the documents. You have provided answers. They send all that to this nice organization, which will
nice.
Yeah, nice. and then, but of course, you have to fight the crime, But basically, usually, then this authority, it will kind of freeze your deposit, and then you start to realize that something bad is gonna happen, most likely. Then you are like something, and then of course you can also complain, explain, but most of the cases indicate this is pretty useless, and usually from few this goes to police, and that means that it's very close that you will lose your funds.
So let's say average person, having some inheritance or made some business money, he doesn't consider himself a criminal in not a classical sense. He's paid his taxes or whatever. He is not thinking in those terms, right? Let's say, but under this process, as we call it, anybody with more or less serious funds, we have this famous example of Raimons Pauls, right, back in the day with Kramer, that was like 15 years ago. Any decent person can become part of that process. So this is where the tricky part, I guess, begins of, crime, not crime, we're proving it, we're not proving it. Can you elaborate on that?
I'm not sure whether I completely will elaborate on that, what you said, but I will now make a fair estimation, yes? The thing is that for many years, actually for decades, to make a fair kind of estimate, like Raimons Pauls, okay, his, let's say, activities are very clear,
He's playing piano.
Yeah, he was playing piano and composing songs, basically, and probably getting royalties. And I would assume that in case of Raimons Pauls, despite many, I would say, horrific things what we have seen in practice, probably Raimons Pauls would get his money back.
Okay.
So to make a fair estimate, most likely, yes,
because he's a public figure.
No, not only because of that, but though who knows? Maybe if he would get something, I know, from Japan on Russia, maybe still. They would find that maybe it was from some bad company or that some company, maybe it was in some list made by journalists and that's why it should be really seriously checked, maybe. But now let's make also a fair kind of step back and explain how funds how many at least, or many cases what we've seen, frankly speaking, of course, it mostly involves different kind of shell companies, transactions made by shell companies. By shell companies, it has become now kind of a bad word, like fictitious company. But at the same time, I would like to remind that to some extent all companies are fictitious, yes, because it's
by nature,
by nature, yes. Yeah. This is artificially made concept, yes, and whether it's fictitious or not fictitious, or shell or not, it's more like a recent kind of concern. But a typical client in ABLV, it was basically some natural person from Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. And usually he would do his business dealings with some clearly offshore companies like registered in Seychelles, BVI, or maybe some UK limited partnerships. So these kind of structures, and this is kind of I also want to kind of provide a kind of fair thing, because. Fair picture of what was happening, because somebody, of course, would certainly kind of start screaming that all that money is dirty, that you can do this or that. But I would say, wait a second, yes. First of all, it was practice for many decades, yes, to use like shell entities for running business, for trading, for providing services. It was like
it was a normal market.
It was a normal thing, yes, and at least it was widely accepted. And to say fair enough, didn't like our authorities didn't know about these kind of practices, like it should be known to regulator. Many banks were doing this, even some, I don't want to call the names, but some of the Scandinavian routes.
I was just about to say Scandinavia.
Yeah,
really?
Yes, they were providing, these kind of also options, and so it was a widely spread practice, and suddenly clients of only one bank horribly suffer from this. But
paradox,
yeah. It's really kind of strange. And possibly also knows there were some other banks which even have like actual cases of I believe of some allegations of money laundering and even probably some judgments made against them. But somehow they didn't suffer from that. But
so everybody was using it.
Yes,
it was widely accepted.
It was in many places. It was in Switzerland, Estonia, Lithuania, like many countries did that. And the question is whether there's something wrong, but we will go into maybe later into details. But it's a fair thing that probably for decades it was tolerated and accepted by authorities. And I even remember that. In some early days, with previous kind of management of financial investigation unit, I remember at seminar I would speak to the head of I forgot what was the name of that time, but I remember I remember a seminar with the head of that same unit, and he would say, using offshore companies, it's fine. It's absolutely accepted. There's nothing illegal. Okay. No, he said, of course, in some cases you can do it, like for bribes, or bribing.
Also, that is there.
Yeah, for stealing. Yes, of course you can do that.
But also a lot of it was done for classical cross-border tax structuring, international businesses.
And it was pretty accepted. And normally you would be concerned. Locally, let's say, if a person depended on, of course, on regulation, but let's say if a person would get a personal benefit, then that would be usually kind of a tax issue in that particular country for that particular person. I would say, from my experience, what I have seen, you could say that some of the structures had like tax issues or risks, but continuing like this process. So once you get to the police, basically it means that you receive a decision on arresting your deposit, okay? And it seems, at least personally, in the early days when you were getting decisions that your assets are arrested, you would understand in relation to what crime your assets are arrested. You would kind of know, like I remember, like I would work with payment services companies, they would say that there's something counterfeiting, like something counterfeited goods in the States you were selling online, so this money probably is illegal. And you understand why, yes?
Yeah. There's a clear sort of chain of events.
Yeah, basically, as we joke that in the days when we went to school, it was you could do money laundering if you had initially committed some kind of or there was a crime committed, so-called predicate crime, which precedes money laundering, like some bribing, stealing, and when you basically move, basically in the result of a crime, some illicit proceeds are created, illicit money. And when you move that money, that's basically laundering, okay?
Yeah.
So
just so everybody knows.
Yeah. So that basically to launder something, there should be a crime beforehand, yes, as a result of which something appears, like some assets are created or stolen. And then once you start to buy something, to pay for some services, that's basically laundering. But initially, presumption was that there should be a crime before that, which precedes money laundering. And normally, it seemed, at least in the world of past, before all this kind of interesting scheme was kind of created, you would normally expect when you get like for example, you are like I had this event of natural person, like retired senior from Israel. When you get your decision on arrest, you would be expecting that you know why it's arrested, what kind of crime has been committed. And I'm not over-exaggerating. When you read the decision on arrest, they literally write sometimes, you know what, plenty of transactions were somehow nearby made, and maybe there's a bribery, maybe something was stolen, and maybe something else happened. I'm not over-exaggerating. It's basically now in these processes that do not bother
with even proving or
not even mentioning. Yeah,
oh, okay.
With not even mentioning
specific crimes
at
that you
least
might
at least a distant crime.
Yeah.
A distant, like.
So what you're saying is that whoever is on the case, he just has to say that he has a suspicion.
Correct.
And that's it. End of story.
Yes, that's it. He basically says, I have a suspicion. I don't have a clue. Where, when,
why,
who, why, whatever. I have just suspicion. Yeah. And I think that's enough for arresting. You can appeal that decision. Doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense for somebody to do that because it's going to go nowhere.
Because maybe we'll later go on. But basically, it's very formal answer. No, this is not. They basically say they have a reason to arrest because they have a reason to arrest.
Yes, and tying that together with the questionnaire that the client would fill when he wants his funds to be returned.
Yeah.
So that suspicion most probably is already connected with whatever is written in the questionnaire based on the client's answers.
Technically,
because he's unaware of it simply.
Technically, the second questionnaire basically. First, it's creditor claim, and then later on, he usually answered some questions, additional questions, and then for his own money and without warning him, basically all this information was analyzed, researched, and this package of his own kind of documents, probably answers and so on, is forwarded to the authorities to move the case forward. Yeah,
and. Let's say the case you mentioned or other cases, let's say there's white area, there's gray area, and there's clearly black. So when we're talking about crime, this chain of events and things like that, then there's the gray and white areas, right? So what you're saying is that, or at least how I hear it, even the people in their businesses in white areas in this situation are under risk, and they have basically no tools how to go against this, because like in my mind, like what would you do if it starts and ends at a suspicion,
Okay. So when you mention whether you have tools or you don't have tools, I mean, technically, we are still in the country which follows the rule of law, correct? So basically, police takes your case. And this is and now there's a kind of magical trick which is happening, I would say,
of institutions. Yeah.
I'm still not really sure whether it was some kind of genius or a group of genius who kind of came up with this idea of easy confiscation, or it's kind of
just
accidental thing. Because this is kind of endless discussion with plenty of these bank clients and clients you work with, explaining how this is possible. And I will try to kind of briefly explain how this is possible.
And they grieve in disbelief.
No, they are just shocked because it's not graspable, because We have cases with some colleagues where people are literally crying in a court because they can't believe
the absurdity of it.
Yeah, absurdity. Because okay, I will just say what happens at the end after you. I mean, you have tools to go to court.
Yes.
But absurdity of this is that in at least most of the cases I've seen, at the end, your funds are confiscated, but you do not understand what kind of crime has been committed.
It's like, and this is a bit hard to believe.
It's hard to grasp, yeah. And even and horrible thing is that even when I speak to some of my colleagues, I mean attorneys, when I say, listen, how this is possible that the person was punished and he does not know for what, yeah? And even now, like some of my colleagues, so it's not a punishment. I say, listen, when somebody comes into your house, takes, I don't know, your
property,
property, your furniture, your paintings, and goes away, and says that most likely, all this property was
somebody else's.
No, not somebody else's. That most likely it was it's illicit proceeds.
Most likely it was near a crime scene some time ago.
Yeah, some time ago. Not sure where and when, but it was nearby. Yeah, and nearby, and that's most likely this is illegal property, and that's why we take it. And there are like some euphemisms because how they do it. I mean, this is like this is beautiful, magical kind of trick. Basically, there's one section in criminal procedure code, which I believe its intention was to solve so-called property issues in criminal cases. And I usually use this one sample. I believe I had like in old days when it made sense. I remember like it was 15 or 20 years ago. There was a train brought like what's called barrels, probably. Yes, that's the name of some.
Train of barrels.
Yeah, barrels. It was a kind of cheap gasoline, low quality gasoline, and it was declared a solvent or something like that. Yeah, and customs guys checked and said, "Come on, guys, it's what kind of solvent is this? This is a cheap gasoline, low quality gasoline. What are you telling us?" And it looks like it's basically smuggling of gasoline. So this is important to understand. Gasoline crosses the border. It's a clear crime. Yes, it looks like a clear crime. There's no much doubt. Yes, it's most likely it's a crime, right? Yeah. And you have gasoline in barrels in the summer, and it's hot, and you have to put it somewhere. Okay, and of course you have expenses to keep all that.
To maintain
gasoline,
that
yeah, because you have to somebody has to pay for it, okay? And of course it's obvious that this case will go for some time, while that gasoline, maybe will explode, okay? And that's why they confiscated to solve the issue in the criminal process, okay? Normally. Yeah. So, in these cases, they basically claim, and basically you cannot do anything. They say, it will take us a long time to investigate the crime. But I had like these cases when it's already like 3 years have passed and nothing has happened. Yes, nothing has really. Okay, they say that they are investigated. Yes, they create a lot of documents and so on, but still not clear what kind of, who is the suspect, what crime, not clear. And then they say probably it will be too burdensome for ABLV to keep that money, which basically are numbers in these digits and somewhere in the computer. That it's too burdensome for ABLV to keep probably these funds. For that reason, it's much better if we confiscate and take it to the state account. Okay, and
So this confiscated, whatever is the state, the confiscated money ends up in a state account.
It's confiscated. That's it.
Wow. Ooh. And from there, what it goes to budget, regular spendings.
Yeah.
So
also, could be is that
sounds like a good business. I don't know. I mean, speculating.
It's
let's say if it happened by accident, that's a remarkable accident. If it happened by design, that's a good business.
Yeah. So it's quite something. And the thing is that in at least cases I've seen, it's basically, yes, a person still does not know what he has committed, what kind of crime.
We were briefly discussing this case you mentioned where there was a chain of companies and then somebody got into a list which was composed by a journalist and you dug into the list.
Yeah.
Can you pull that up one? Because this is, let's say, a financial one and this is, I guess, a relatable situation, right, to many.
Yeah, this was one of the most horrible situations what I saw, which is actually a great illustration of this problem, and I would say even personal tragedy, and I would even justice system tragedy to some extent. An old person claims that she had some funds in cash, that she kept it in cash in some foreign country, and her friend or business partner agreed to take a loan,
to borrow that money,
to use it. And quite many years ago, he repaid her to her Latvian bank account.
So he repaid many years before the investigations began.
Yeah, before that. And that person was living peacefully, keeping her money and so on. And
old, we're talking what, 60, 70?
75 years old, something like that. Really old, reputable lady. But of course, by contemporary standards, basically, she cannot demonstrate clear source of those funds.
Mm-hmm.
That's so. To make it also realistic, she cannot do that. I mean, she claims family values, assets. She left the Soviet Union many years ago. She had to sell everything. Funds were with her relatives. There are many, actually, people from all over the world wrote letters saying that, she's a good lady. She had a lot of assets and so on.
So it was a public case.
It was not public, but we were doing substantial filings, and in her case, the situation was that her partner, this. Let's call it business partner.
The one who borrowed.
He had plenty of businesses through these kind of shell companies, but frankly, checking these kind of transactions, you could see that he was trading. I mean, on the surface, it was just pure trading. There were German companies, Chinese companies, just very active trading, huge volumes. But when you read documents, case documents, all that case goes through the fact that this business guy who had several companies, he was also trading with other company, which was included in so-called Russian laundromat. Okay.
So let's say 2 layers below the lady already.
Even 3. Yeah. Even 3 layers below, really somewhere distantly.
Mm-hmm.
And they said basically the fact that somebody is included in the list of compiled by these journalists, and there were 6,000, 7,000 companies just list. It already indicates, they wrote it basically, it already indicates that this is some wrongdoing has been committed. And they tell this could be like, again, bribing, maybe tax, whatever. They're not indicating anything. So through journalists, actually, we saw that database, we opened it, and found that company in the list, and we could not find any. Basically, all information the company had about it was that in 1 year it had some 2 transactions with some other company which is not listed. So basically, from court documents, the whole case is based on reference to database. They even had not opened it. Reference to that database. We showed it. They said, "Listen, look at this. This is full. This is just crap, you know.
Yeah.
Like there's like old person with all her savings, and okay, she by contemporary standards, she cannot demonstrate origin of those funds. But at the same time, listen,
she have to?
But yes, but you are confiscating thing, you know. At least show some real kind of crime." And basically, all that didn't matter. We after the case with other kind of lawyer, we were discussing it, and sadly joking that we do not understand how we can lose this case, how this person can lose money, but we realize that she will lose it, unfortunately, and she did. And so, still, today, like, there's no clue for what she lost.
Yeah, but if you look at it from another perspective, from the governments, let's say you have 3 layers of companies, and you have all of those, let's say, transactions, then it becomes at one point very tedious or sometimes almost impossible to prove something or to even investigate something, right? Because years have passed, I don't know, registries disappear and things like that.
Yeah.
So why should they bother?
It seems that now they should not.
Yeah,
because there's no consequences for them. But why should? The question is if we should bother, because still this is this kind of situation. Person has lost her savings. Yes, and she doesn't understand for what. Yeah,
I love this, you know, because here we're crossing a border between law and philosophy, right? So this is where we're exactly there.
Yes, but frankly, also law-wise, I do not understand. Listen, there was a kind of really interesting conversation some time ago, and many attorneys were listening to it. It was somebody from the parliament, attorney general was participating, police, some attorneys were participating, and they were discussing how these kind of, let's say, new rules, how they function. And actually, the person from the parliament, he did not believe that this is what happens. But basically, there's this kind of thing. Assets of let's say, unclear origin do not mean that these are of criminal origin. That's this kind of crucial difference. Yeah. And so if I go to court and if I don't see even a distant kind of indication of any crime, I'll give you another example. Yes, what I would understand, like, or 2 examples. I love these 2 examples. Yes, there was, I think, in UK. There was this event when somebody, I don't want to insult anyone, but I think it was somebody from the Central Asia, and the wife in some store was spending like 20 or so millions, and her husband was something like a public official or working for a bank. Yes, and then of course I can see a relation if you are a public official and your wife can spend.
20 million.
20 million. I can see that probably it's potential indication of a bribe, unless, and here this lower type of burden of proof should come in. Mm-hmm. Yes, when you say, okay, yes, I was a public official, but I know I was trading shares like very successfully, I know, or I found a piece of gold, somewhere in a river, when I was a child and we sold it, or some kind of thing. And then you have a lower, then for authorities, there's a lower kind of burden of proof. Or another example, which was also discussed in that, let's say not hearing, but meeting.
Yeah.
Meeting at the parliament I just mentioned. They mentioned selling, let's say, drugs. And they said that the idea in general, at least from legislature, so we can also speak about branches of power, judiciary, legislature, and executive. And they said that idea was that when, let's say, somebody's selling cocaine, you cannot really determine from which each particular small transaction of selling, small bag of cocaine, all that illicit money comes. And unless you can prove the opposite, yes, that it comes from somewhere else, because there's obvious crime, yes, and you just cannot really say which 100 euros are related to which transaction, yes.
This Scarface scene, yeah?
Okay, Scarface scene is, I love it, yes. It's basically when Tony Montana sits at the table in Scarface in the ending, at the end of the movie, and he has like a small hill of cocaine and he has a gun in his hand. And let's say if Latvian police is coming in suddenly, yes, cooperating with American police, comes in, and they find, let's say, a suitcase full of cash, okay, and they say, listen, Tony Montana, we can do easy confiscation of that money, because most likely that's related to that cocaine, right? And now you have to prove that that's not true. That was the idea of legislature. And Tony Montana comes and says, you know what? On weekends, me and my family or my hookers, we do a lemonade stand, and we sell lemonade at the park. And that's where the cash comes from. And then Latvian police could think, not very likely.
Not plausible, yeah.
Not plausible, yeah. And then you have a lower burden of proof, okay? But they have a kind of concrete indication. But in this case, there's a list, with this old lady case, there's a list of some companies which probably journalists stole somewhere. They publish it. Somebody found some company, and then through 2, 3, or I don't know, or how many layers, they say, you must be related to some crime. But what crime? What kind of crime? What happens there? There's nothing in that database about that company.
Yeah, no, nothing about any crimes or whatever.
Most likely, that's those are illicit proceeds. Thank you very much. Welcome,
See you never.
welcome to Latvia, and never come back again.
Do you think similar stuff is happening elsewhere, or this is like very exclusive to? And also, before we jumped at, you said new rules. Let's say there were the old rules back in the day when everything was accepted, and you have the new rules. Is there a timeline? How far back it reaches? Or not really? It can be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years.
It's a very valid question, and we also raise it. But at court, in courts, usually they just ignore it.
Okay.
Yeah, because in principle, I would say, in my humble opinion, the thing is that for decades, basically, you had one standard of origin of your money, and now suddenly you say, listen, that money which you made, and we really still see cases like something happened, I know, in 2008, 2009, and in 2022 they say, listen, man, that's really strange what you did, but try to recall what happened. And we say just most likely is that those are illegal proceeds. And
Whoa.
Yeah, it's that tough, yeah.
And I mean, average business person that's in business for 20 years, that's a big, broad sort of part of business people.
I will comment to this. So again, to make a fair estimate, I will not know, let's say, fair picture of. The thing is that I also try to explain to these people in ABLV. I say that unfortunately you're just very unlucky, because from, let's say, other banks, people were just allowed to leave. Okay, it wasn't that actually easy, because some banks were like taking some deposits and so on. That's another story, a funny story. But I would be even afraid to tell it, because then it's But I'm even now afraid, like thinking about this.
I say, I mean, we can change the voice, and we can put some pixels on your face.
That would be nice.
if you're afraid about your life.
But actually, there are some. There's one very brave colleague of ours, Edgars. She makes like very kind of straightforward and very honest articles. She even had like some public feud with financial investigation unit that she is too open and honest about some of the aspects of the case.
And then being too open and too honest publicly, that's obviously not welcome, right? I mean, because those things should be happening behind the closed curtain.
You see, we still, at least, we are still kind of considered to be the place of the rule of law, okay? But going back, I'm going back to what you said. I mean, first of all, speaking about business and these things and dealings, I think you could say that these guys who got stuck and lost their funds in ABLV, they're very unlucky, because they represent the past. Because nowadays, you cannot open a tax haven company with an account. Okay, maybe you can do it if you are super rich somewhere in Switzerland. If
extremely protected.
Yeah, if you have 10 million, or I know Monaco or Dubai. Actually, they still anyway. You still have Bahamas, and these centers still work, but it has become like very difficult, and most of people are doing it through now, let's call it onshore jurisdictions, and there's still plenty of options, right? And
but some time ago, those funds were connected to offshore jurisdictions in many cases.
Yeah. And so let's go forward. So now, what I'm telling, if we look into the future, what I'm telling is that, in my humble opinion, the problem and tragedy of these proceedings are that if, like in this case of the old person who was basically punished, a senior person, I think that's more appropriate to say, a very nice person, if the system learns to punish people without any substantial proof of any crime and so on, it means that everybody gets used, and basically threshold of proof, burden of proof is so low that probably in the future or even now, whomever can be challenged.
Because there's a precedent.
Zillions of precedents now. That's basically procedure. Like even now I have a case with Ukrainian guys who are prudent business persons, and they sold some assets in the past, yes, and generated profit, and now it's frozen. And we discuss with authorities. We submit documents, And I'm saying like, okay, we showed the documents. Why do you think that it's? Do you think it's still like these are illicit proceeds? And she tells me yes. Okay. So I'm asking like why? Like what crime? What's relation to crime or why it's illicit proceeds? And basically she cannot answer me. She just says, I think. She asked me, do you think they conducted their business in a prudent way? I'm asking like, what do you mean? Like, are you conducting your investigation in prudent way? What if somebody comes to your house and takes your furniture, I know your kid's computer, and are you conducting your investigation in prudent way? She cannot answer.
Yeah. So it's absurdity,
Yes,
in and
and
out.
it means that when they will be done with these kind of clients, then what will happen next?
So what will happen next and going into the future? Because obviously, I understand that's the nature of the business, kind of dealing with those things, and people oftentimes oversee that there's also another sort of layer of reality just hovering around your head, until it's not material, until it's materialized. Looking into the future, so what should people do, and how should people, let's say, unlikely event, hopefully that will not happen to prudent businessmen and then people with funds, but let's say, what would you do to avoid this kind of situation, this kind of case? If you have a longer history of your origin of funds, right? Because this is what we're eventually talking about, 10 years of history or whatever. We're not talking about somebody sold his company shares and, everything's quite obvious. But if there's a longer history of money management.
There's no straightforward answer. One proposition is certainly to keep some funds outside of Latvia.
Yeah,
that's for sure. Because it's that's like I think now basically even now let's say when sometimes it's even strange that sometimes some investors are coming in and we do consulting on the origin of their funds, right? We are like discussing like and I openly say them, listen, you according to our standards, you're not welcome, because there's plenty of businesses which were structured like through offshores some time ago. And let's say in Switzerland, it's fine, but here, if you cannot demonstrate like tax declarations, reports, which are like 15 years old or whatever, basically you have risk. Because
you partially answered the question, right? You should be, let's say, very diligent on the document and the paper trail of God knows how long ago. Then you can be considered, let's say.
Basically we also say that I don't care what's your difficulties. If you want to feel more or less safe, you should go to your home country, dig up archives, because really like technique here for confiscation now is like they can create like a binder full of documents, which is a lot of payments, some articles in newspaper and so on. And they can claim that it's illegal, it's illicit. They have suspicions that it's illicit, and if they can get like arrest on your funds, then good luck in the future. So that's a realistic risk, because when we think as like business people, and I would tend to think that I also think as a business person, like. If, for example, you give a loan from one of your companies to another.
Of your own companies.
If your own companies, yes. Or
that's a good one, because that happens oftenly.
You just put money from one of your pockets to another. when an investigator looks at it, he says, I don't like it. He says, why did you do that? What's the economic purpose? Yes. They keep asking you these kind of questions, and you really feel like you're in a Kafka process.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even like if
Kafka, the author, yeah.
The author, the book, and actually very often people, especially who have substantial assets, they say, "Listen, I even don't remember what happened a couple of years ago." Yes, you kind of.
Yeah, of course. This is normal.
But the thing is that you have not stolen anything. Yes, you didn't get a bribe. Yeah, probably somewhere at least you paid some tax. Yeah, and you're living basically in a kind of unreal world
to a certain point.
Yeah. And also like some of my colleagues, I think, correctly point out, now there's this also problem situation that in many of these cases, like studying, teaching, and so on, it all combines all authorities together, like police, courts, public prosecutor's office, and so on. So in principle, there should be separation of powers in theory, yes? Court should be independent. I should check it myself, but at least from some sources, they say that investigators are getting actually additional bonuses if they
confiscate funds.
Confiscate funds, yeah.
Ooh, that's a statement.
Yeah, that's kind of strange interpretation of justice system, and
that's a good motivator.
Yes, it's a good motivator. Yes, and these people teach judges how they should act. Yeah, they say you should follow these kind of principles. Okay, and so it's and ultimately, I remember like in early days. Before war and all other kind of things, we would meet like colleagues in Belarus or Russia, and we would discuss this, that in principle there I'm just thinking it's executory or executory branch and court, judiciary, it's basically effectively merged together. It means that, let's say, I had some business.
I just want to kind of make it clear. I think this could be common to many countries, not only Latvia as an exclusive case. Or you think it's...
You think this merging kind of type thing?
Of authorities.
Actually, when I speak to some colleagues, I mean, it's very kind of especially dangerous, I think, in criminal cases because consequences of a criminal case are very kind of serious, right? You can lose like your freedom, funds, and of course, if you start to kind of feel that there's no separation of powers and court decision can be influenced by other decision makers, then it's a huge problem. I mean, huge problem for rule of law, but I think also when I speak to colleagues in Lithuania, Estonia, we didn't speak about these criminal cases because about this confiscation of bank deposits, and because it seems to me that it's rather unique. But we spoke about administrative proceedings, for example, in tax cases, or basically when you litigate against state, then most of colleagues in other places would say that they also think that it's more like, let's say, kind of ritual type of thing.
Yeah.
Going to court, but usually, of course, it's very subjective. But like in 90% of cases, let's assume it's basically already knows that probably it will not end for you well. So you kind of doubt with experience, especially you start to doubt whether legal argumentation is okay. Legal argumentation, of course, exists. You can tell it to somebody, but it seems that there are like at least several, I would say in our home country, I would feel it like in VAT cases. Yeah,
of course. I mean,
So basically,
that's fine.
what's the incentive for court to be on the side of a private individual claimant if court is also funded from the state budget, you know, and
to some extent it sounds logical, right? And it makes sense. I think it's then the matter of how perverse the picture is in any given market, and you know, where do you have these situations where it has, you know, popped to the surface, appeared. Listen, Edgars, I know this is a heavy topic for you, and you could go for days about this talking. And I also know that we wanted to talk about taxation, but I feel taxation, just in order not to mix the vibes, right? Because this was very, very sort of in depth.
It was
personally to me interesting. You know, it was interesting listening to you, and I think we will do the taxation part on a separate, separate podcast. So I don't know. Maybe we wrap up today. What do you feel? Yeah. Guys? Good.
Yeah.
Good. Edgars, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
See you again. And if guys have anything to comment, please write down in comments questions. So it would be interesting to me. Listen, is there any similar experiences in our investor group or whoever is watching? So yeah, I think there will be continuation on the tax part about the cross-border structures and things like that. You know, that might be relevant to somebody. Good.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.